Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Policy Subcommittee. We have quite a bit on our agenda for today, and this meeting will be recorded. As often the case, the chat is enabled for any attendees who would like to participate with questions or comments. So first off on our agenda today is approval of the minutes from January 11th. Have subcommittee members had an opportunity to review them? All right, would someone like to make a motion?
I'll move it.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
All right, Andy?
Yes.
Dimitri?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, so that's now approved. So next up, we will have a discussion on the policy of grouping and inclusion. And we are joined today by Hal Mason, the assistant headmaster at the high school, as well as Michelle Herman, who's running teaching and learning this year, and Principal Asa Sevelius at the Heath School. So thank you very much for coming. The reason why I was hoping you'd be able to come is to explain what the current practices are around grouping and inclusion, how placement takes place at both the K-8 level and at the high school. So perhaps we could start with K-8. So if you'd like to go, Asa.
And David, I just want to note that we have a few other principals joining. We just ended a meeting, so they're probably just catching up and we'll be signing on also.
All right, thank you for that.
So thanks. I can only speak on behalf of the process at Heath School. I think every school does it slightly differently. But we take class placement really seriously and dedicate a lot of time to it. In fact, in March, I have kind of an annual calendar reminder to begin prepping for the class placement process. Essentially, what happens is every teacher is involved, looking at the best mix up what really worked in the grade that the kids are currently at, and then moving them forward in a way that maintains balanced classrooms, but also gives kids a really good opportunity to meet new people, right, and have those experiences. At Heath, we put a very particular emphasis on our students of color to make sure that they are in affinity groups in their classrooms, so that we would not have one Chinese American student alone in a class and then 3 others in a class. We really would want all of them together if the numbers allow, or to have 2 or 3 robust pockets of kids whose parents identify them as Black or Latinx or Asian American in our database. So we want robust affinity groups for those kids. And we also want to have balanced representation of special education students who have IEPs in our classrooms as well. But those are our main priority groups, I would say. And then from there, we would have other priority groups. If we had LGBTQ kids, or if we had trans kids, we would be looking at their very particular needs and be doing placement according to that kind of criteria that we've developed as a school. But essentially, at the end of the day, we want really just balanced groups of kids that can be happy together, that can learn together, and that can find real partnership and affinity in the classrooms. So that's really the big nutshell version of what we're looking at.
Thank you. We have a question from Andy. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks.
Sure.
Just wondering, what do you mean by balanced here? For kids on IEPs in particular, does that mean that each class is supposed to have a roughly the same proportion of kids on IEPs as the school as a whole? Or
No, not necessarily. I think if we want to be able to group students based on their very particular needs. So if we had 3 kids across a 3rd grade, let's say, that had very similar kind of reading supports, that had really robust goals in reading, for example, we might want them in one class so that their inclusion, we could have an inclusion model rather than a pull out model, for example. It doesn't always work that way. That's why every single year it's a really complicated multi-hour, multi-month process of looking at students. Because it might be that we have kids whose kind of goals in their IEPs absolutely don't overlap at all, but we still don't want students who are getting any pullout services to really be spotlighted in a way that's going to really kind of separate them or put them in a position where they have to explain where they're coming and going. We want them to have kind of more that holistic experience where they feel really at ease in all the services and who's pushing in and the kinds of support they're getting from other adults. Yeah.
All right, Casey, would you like to add to that about the implications for special education students?
No, I think Asa explained it. Donna, we have Donna Finnegan here too, who could speak to the K-8s. And just in case folks didn't know, Mindy Paolo was able to join too. And we have Jen Buller to speak to their school's practices too. I don't know if either any of you have anything to say with regard to Andy's question.
I didn't hear the question in the beginning. I apologize. Mindy and I were on the phone about another case. But I don't want to repeat what Asa said, so I'm just checking.
Question had just been about, Asa had used the word balance. And I wasn't sure what that meant, whether that meant proportionality or it meant the formation of affinity groups. And so that's what he was running with.
Right. And the same, and at Runkle, the way it also plays out with, because we have a specialized program for students on the autism spectrum, our RISE program, we have to be very careful that we place students from that program. Often we place them in classes so that they're supported by, they don't all have one-on-one paraprofessionals. They often share staff or share a para. So we have to be careful about how we place students in that role too, so that they can share staff. And it's balanced.
All right, thank you. Would any other K-8 principals like to speak about their inclusion, grouping, and placement practices?
We try, I mean, at Ruff and Ridley, we try to make sure when we're talking specifically about special education students with a lot of EL support, that similar to what Asa said, that we're grouping them in a way that makes services as seamless as possible. And then we try to, from the teacher perspective, not, because we have the Therapeutic Learning Center, we also try to not have two programs happening simultaneously in one classroom, so that overloads like a teacher's meeting schedule and is pulling the teacher out of the classroom a lot. So when we group students too, we're also looking at the meeting patterns that they would have to go to based on students' IEPs and things like that. And we want to balance that out so that teachers can spend as much time as possible in the classroom, but also meet all the legal obligations for consults and IEP meetings and things like that.
And that goes back to what I said at the beginning, just to jump back in, is that each school is so particular that you'll find that the practices have to be very unique at the Ridley or at Runkle because of the really, or other places as well, because at Driscoll, because of the really unique programming offered. At a school, for example, with our English learners, Heath has a lot of English learners, but they're completely spread out. There's no like really big, huge cohort in any one or two grade levels. We don't have any specialized language programs. So that might look completely different, is how they're thinking about grouping kids in that way. But I think what we're hearing is that we each have a way of thinking about affinity, balance for the adults, balance for the kids as well.
And Asa touched a little bit on the EL side of it too. So for people who do have, we also have a language program at our school. We have the Hebrew EL program, and we try to cluster Hebrew speakers together, but I've also heard from teachers that can make it really hard, because then those students tend to just stay with and talk with each other and not necessarily speak as much English as we'd like them to be doing in the classroom. So we try to be, listening to what teachers are saying too, based on, every year we're adjusting our practices for class placement and refining it and learning year to year. And so we try to be responsive to that as well, where we can create clusters so that for services, EL students can be serviced in a really good comprehensive way, and that they have some peers that speak the same language as they do, but not create some sort of isolating pocket that makes it hard for them to branch out, and other students to branch in to those groups that are sometimes formed.
Do you have a sense of what the best cluster size is so that it's big enough to, be worthwhile, but not so big that people can just self-segregate into their native language?
I don't know. I mean, it also really, like, I think Asa said, it depends on the size. Like, so we're a 5-section school, so we do have the luxury of being able to spread students out if we need to. And I think we find like 3 or 4 students is like a good cluster size without it becoming super isolating if we're talking about a class size of around 20.
If I can also just add in terms of the ELE placement side, I do have to say that I believe our principals and the teachers do an excellent job placing students and taking into consideration not only what their native language is, their level of English proficiency, so that we don't have all beginners, so that they can learn from model students who are more fluent in the language, and also based on their service levels. The challenge we find comes in the middle school, because the middle school schedule actually dictates how we're able to service K through 5. So we have not found a system that works effectively yet across the district. What we have tried to do is identify perhaps 2 homerooms where we would place English learners so that the teachers who service those students are able to schedule them in without having a significant impact on K to 5. There are some regulations, some legalities around how we can group students. So in order for us to be able to be in compliance, that's something that's really important that we take into consideration. So I think we do an excellent job with what we have. Our schools are big. We have high numbers of English learners in some of our schools. At Heath, for example, we only have 1 teacher who works across 9 grades. Exceptionally difficult to schedule all of those students. In larger schools where we have 3, 4, 5 staff members, it's a bit easier. But the middle school undoubtedly is certainly the greatest challenge with scheduling the students. In terms of how we place them, I should say.
All right, thank you for that. Jennifer, do you have a question?
I really appreciate all the information of, talking about balance and, really being mindful of cohorts of students that would support each other. And it's something that I've experienced as a parent. And so I'm just trying to figure out, and maybe every school is different. I have my kids in 2 different schools, but it was definitely a trend. And it was something that was sort of told to me by other parents before I really got into the school. And I was surprised when it actually happened. And so I'm just wondering, what a common trend is that if a student in a family gets 1 teacher, other siblings will sometimes, and I see Asa shaking, and I'm not saying this happens in all schools, and I get it. I'm just trying to, that is a common thing. And so whether or not it's happening or happens in certain schools, it's definitely out there in the community. And so I think that it would just be helpful. And it did happen. Sometimes it happened to us and sometimes it didn't. So where another sibling gets that same string of teachers. And so it's hard to balance the conversation of cohorts and affinity groups and ELL students and special education and balance when there's also this conversation out there. So I was just wondering if someone could speak to that and sort of clarify that for members of the community.
All right, go ahead, Ms. Bueller.
So the only, at Ruff and Ridley, the only time we think about siblings and placing them to a specific teacher is in kindergarten. So we think about matching students and families to kindergarten teachers where they've had a positive experience. Of course, if it's not been a good relationship, we don't steer families that way. And we take family input on, there's families that write letters and say, this was a really good experience for this child, but for my second child, I don't think this is going to be a good match. And we take that into consideration because we really want that first relationship, that first experience in kindergarten to be solid. And so if a teacher already knows that family and has a good relationship with them, we want to put that child in that space to set up. Otherwise, all of our placement processes are blind. And so what we're doing is we're creating balanced cohorts without teacher names. And so we don't think about siblings and who had this teacher and things like that. Sometimes it might just happen that way. But at Ruff and Ridley, we make 5 balanced sections completely blind. And then it's myself, the vice principals, and the guidance counselors who then talk about the teacher for each classroom. Asa?
Go ahead, Asa.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're wrong, Jennifer. I'm not saying you're like, oh my God, this is insane. No, absolutely not. I think that there are a lot of reasons why students get the teacher they get or don't get the teacher they get. And again, that's unique to every single circumstance. But it used to be, and this was very difficult, and so I will speak transparently about this. It used to be that the receiving teachers at Heath School would sit on the other side of the table while the teachers who had the students currently did the shuffling right there in front of the receiving teachers. And we would put the cards right in front of the teacher. And about 3 years ago, we were like, what are we doing? This is not cool. And so people were really tracking the deck, and so now that doesn't happen. We just put class A, class B, class C, and then like at the Ridley, we really do. I place the kids. I give the teacher card on top. And that feels very good. But we've also had parents, say things like, I don't know what I'm going to do if I don't get this teacher X. And we're very clear in all of our literature and all of our letters that go out that we do not take teacher requests. I've definitely had meetings with parents who are like, and by the way, if we could get teacher X, and I close my notebook and I say, I'm listening, but we do not take teacher requests. There is no record of this kind of request, and I'm going to move forward as we do. And that's really hard because people really believe what they believe, and they really want their kid, if they had a positive experience, they really want a second kid or third kid to have that same experience. And if they had a really hard experience, they never want to have that kid again. And so there's a lot of thinking that goes behind the scenes, but I don't disagree, Jennifer, that there's a lot of reasons why a kid may or may not get a repeat teacher in a family. But kind of on the surface, what you're going to see is as much of a blind process as possible.
Yeah, can I follow up, David?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I understand, I feel like I understand a lot about the placement process. That's I think what you're describing, and I'm sort of setting up class cohorts and then assigning teachers later, I think is a common way, more and more common way to do class placement. And so, I just think it's helpful. I really appreciate you putting it into that, both of you, Ms. Fuller, as well, like putting into that perspective for parents to say that for some schools it may have been like that, and for some it might be a shift, and people are doing some things in different ways. But I think it's helpful because there has been that conversation historically. And so I think that it just helps families to understand in a full context of the balance of, and it is challenging, to class placement is a challenging process. There's a lot of variables and a lot of factors, and it's really hard. And a lot of thought goes into it. And so I just think that that's helpful for families to understand.
If I can go back into it, and I apologize if I'm just dominating and talking out of turn, but I feel like I do better in a conversation. We do offer every parent an opportunity to fill out a form. Tell us your kid's learning style. What are some things we may have forgotten? Even if you think I know it, put it on the paper. Who are their 3 best friends? What are the things that are anxiety provoking, or I forget what all of our questions are, but it's about a 5 or 6 questionnaire that goes out to families every spring. And at least 50% of our parents fill it out. And teachers have full access to all of that information. And so while they're also there with these little cards with the kids' names on it, they also have piles and piles of paper that they're referring to throughout the process. So parent input is important. We just can't make promises that we can't keep, right?
So to that point about parent input, we have a comment in the chat from Linda Monak, the co-chair of CPAC, who writes that allowing parents to express input on teaching style that works well for their children, especially in younger grades before they are well known by school, is helpful. Not specific teachers, but teaching style. So maybe a question for one of the principals who has not spoken yet. If either you, Mr. Lewis, or you, Mr. Mason, would like to comment on how parental input becomes a factor in placement decisions?
Yeah, I can comment. Hello, Ms. Monop. She made the question. She's a Baker parent. Yeah, so that's exactly. So this is what she suggested there is not just unique to Brookline or Baker. It's very rare that a school would take teacher requests. And what you do, you offer a question on the questionnaire, your letter to how's your child learn? What's the best way? What's the teaching style that works for them? And we definitely take that into consideration when making class placements at Baker and in other places I've worked in my career.
Now, Mr. Mason, I'm guessing at the high school, this is probably handled a bit differently.
Yeah, I mean,
Like-
it's a different structure. Obviously, you're not going into a single class. So when we talk about, grouping, we're talking more about how we're setting up our advisories, which are groups that will stay together for 4 years, making sure those are diverse, making sure that those have kids from all 8 schools, making sure that the gender balance is there. Looking at things like that. In terms of the courses, the school is so large and there's so many courses that most of the time things will fall into some type of good balance. Not always. Occasionally you have courses that fall out of balance. I remember last year we had one course in the WISP that turned out to have 18 boys in the class. So we don't go down to that level. We just, we do that for advisory. We do that with some other courses, but we try not to, we're not looking at 800 different courses over the catalog to make sure that each one has balance, but we are, we at the size that we have, generally speaking, it doesn't become a problem.
If you become aware of a specific issue between 2 or more students, are there efforts made to ensure that they are not grouped together?
Yes, absolutely. We put out each year separation. We want to know from the 8th grade counselors that they have documented issues that we need to know about. And then we track those within Aspen X2, and that will work to make sure that students are not scheduled together. It's interesting. We have more experience with this now over the last couple of years because of setting up OLS and doing the cohorts at OLS. And there I did a lot of work to make sure that I was creating 2 balanced cohorts. Since I was essentially creating 2 different schools with the red cohort and the blue cohort, we wanted to make sure that those cohorts were balanced and looked the same. And that took a lot of work to make sure that we had all of the different demographic categories that come into the high school, that we had them in both cohorts. But that was last year and this year in setting up OLS.
Okay. Do any subcommittee members have further questions? Andy?
Yeah, I'm just wondering sort of procedurally how input from current teachers sort of feeds into the process. So Asa, you said that you don't have, say, the 2nd grade teachers sitting across from the 3rd grade teachers and that matching happening, but do the 2nd grade teachers all sit together in forming sort of the groups that then have the 3rd grade teacher cards laid on top of them?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, over many hours, really, shuffling and looking and talking and again, flipping through the papers and looking at caseloads we have not only our teachers, but our special educators are at the table. Our English learners teacher, Ms. Mills, is at the table typically. Our interventionists, if able, our team facilitator, special education team facilitators at the table, vice principal. So there's a lot of people watching and talking and thinking and mapping, lots of shuffling. It's a really, really kinetic and active process, which is why when we're ready to roll out our lists, we tend to have really high parent satisfaction. And I think it's because of all the behind the scenes work that's gone on.
It usually takes like 3, I would say, like Ace is describing, like 3 iterations of, it starts with the general ed teachers and then it moves to, hopefully special ed can work in conjunction when they're doing that first round of shuffling. And then it moves to specialists, and then it moves to, anybody else who's looking at it. And then the last, to answer the question about separating students that might have a problem, typically what I've done is at the last look over, I'm holding all those papers, all the feedback from parents, and then I get another person and I just go through every single letter or every single feedback form from a parent and make sure that we didn't put, John with Susie if they don't get along. And we covered all those things, and we can't move on until every paper is checked off that we've met. And we can't always meet all the needs for friendship groups. Like you're not going to get, we always ask for maybe name 3 and we promise you'll get 1. But we make sure that we can check off every single parent form that we've at least addressed the needs that they've asked for.
In terms of parent forums, we have a question in the chat about whether these are standardized across schools.
I don't think they're standardized, but I would say that they're like very similar. I know every principal creates their own Google form or whatever they're using and asks similar questions, but you know, it's not just one form that exists across the district.
Okay. And then we also have a question about whether paraprofessional shortages play into the placement process.
No, I mean, sorry, I'm just jumping into the
Go
answer.
ahead, that's fine.
Go for it.
No, we plan, when we're placing as if we were fully staffed. So we're not taking into account, we're using the staffing as if we were going to be fully staffed starting in September.
I do have my parent perspective questionnaire up, right? And the questions are, what's the best fit classroom? Short answer, friendships are important. You know, a couple of little sentences, name 3 to 5. We'll work to get one of those good friends with your child. How does your child see their strengths? What does your child see as their growing edge? And so we present this form as an opportunity to sit together as a family, not just a parent kind of, you know, on the fly, you know, while making dinner, right, jotting down some notes, but to sit and talk. And then identify something your child would like us to know that might help them in this, you know, in school, and then remind us of something that we might have forgotten as we begin to engage in this process. So we want it to be an experience where people, parents and children, family members and children sit down together and talk it out.
All right, thank you. Now, for those of you who've had an opportunity to review the actual policy that we are discussing right now, is there anything that you think necessitates modification of some kind, whether that means inserting clarifying language or adding a provision or removing a provision? And
Actually,
asking,
David,
yes.
sorry, David, if I could come in on that. So one, I wanted to say thank you to all the principals for informing us and letting us know how the process works. It's really informative. But I think at our level, so not to be micromanagement of your work, is just to understand actually on that particular questions. Because I think that's where we can best partner with you all. Are there elements in the policy that from your perspective either makes the job difficult or the placement process much more difficult for you that ought to be addressed to make it more efficient or easier in your process?
If I could ask, what's the policy, or what's the shift happening here, or what is the kind of the macro question?
So there's a lot of interest in the community around what the practices are behind grouping, inclusion, and placement. The school committee has a policy on that that has been in place since 1997. And I think this is a good opportunity for members of the public to understand the great work and thoughtfulness and insight that goes into these inclusion practices and how student interests are at the forefront in creating these classroom assignments, for example. But as a part of that, if there is an area where we're falling a little short, or if there's not quite exact alignments between what's taking place and what's written in the policy, it's helpful for us as members of the policy subcommittee to know whether there are any changes that ought to be made. Just because we talk about a policy doesn't mean we're going to change it. It's also a good opportunity to just reflect on what's currently taking place. Mindy?
I'm not exactly sure where it would fall into the policy, but I did note where we mention IDEA as one of the legal components that we're considering with this. I'm wondering, in most recent years, we have also put in place, the state has some legal language around all students, all English learners must be placed with teachers who have a specific endorsement. So it's specific to placement, but in order for us to be in compliance, we are only allowed to place English learners with teachers who have a specific endorsement. And I don't see language like that in here, and I'm not sure where it would go. The other question I had is in that fourth bullet under the first section where we talk about in order to create effective learning environments and maintain valued diversity within each classroom. I personally, perhaps because I work with a very diverse population, I'd be curious to know how we're defining diversity. So when we are looking at that particular language, what does it mean when we're considering student grouping, inclusion, and placement? And I don't know if that needs to be thought out more, or if folks are just comfortable with the way that is.
Does anyone, do any principals or subcommittee members have thoughts on that, of whether diversity should be more specifically defined?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
I think that we can add a lot more meat to our understandings, right? Of what, with real definitions, what does affinity mean? What is an affinity group? What are ranges, number ranges, right? Within a 20-person classroom, what does an affinity group potentially look like? The idea that we have in the past said, okay, at Heath School, we've welcomed 3 students through the METCO program. And this was past practice. Oh, thank you. My daughter is bringing my charger down. We have, we have welcomed 3 METCO students into our kindergarten class. We'll put 1 in this class, 1 in this class, and 1 in this class. That is not affinity, right? That's not best practice. And so those kinds of things feel like we could really use some good guide rails, so to speak. But I do think that the ways that we're thinking about diversity and inclusion and equity, that's a work in practice in Brookline, and I would like that to be a part of our mission statement around these kinds of decisions that we make. But I don't know that we're all on the same page yet. So if that was something that, needed to be looked at or crafted, I think we could definitely, start to think about that in a really productive way. That feels important.
So a question I have for you, Casey, do you feel that that's something that would belong in the policy or more in the procedures that are promulgated as a reflection of the policy? Because just one potential concern I have is if we get too specific, then we might be hamstringing our principals in terms of how they actually proceed with placement. I definitely appreciate the conversation around diversity and inclusion and the importance of understanding what those terms mean, but I'm not sure personally that the policy is the right place to delve into that detail. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think on most things, I would prefer to have that latitude simply because our schools are unique and have different practices that are specific to their schools for good reason, I would hope, but allowing us to have some latitude to review things through an equity lens, better defining certain roles, terms that we use, I think would be helpful to have that flexibility.
Is there anything that you feel ought to be added, subtracted, or are you fairly comfortable with how the policy is currently worded?
Michelle Herman and I were talking about it a little bit. There's some, was it antiquated terms, Michelle? Let me just pull it up again.
Yeah, well, I think I was looking a little bit above at one of the other policies that led to it, because it's in the transfer policy, there's some information around placing students but it's also not in this part of the policy. Some antiquated language about ability and I forgot what I said. Hold on, I wrote it down somewhere. Some language around ability and achievement and some language around testing, and it doesn't seem to follow the current Brookline practice of what are we determining as ability and achievement. So being that we've moved to a standards-based practice, I think the idea that it talks about the learning expectations is important in there, and that students are looking at how students are progressing on the learning expectations, but it feels like in the 2 areas in the policy, in the student policy, they don't quite match.
Okay. Anyone else? either principals or subcommittee members?
David, Linda had a suggestion in the chat that I think Casey probably would be better handled within the district staff and working with the principals, but I don't know if you've had a chance to see it.
Sorry, I'll scroll up a bit. It would be great if OSS or SC could review everyone's parent questionnaires and ensure that there's equity across schools and perhaps offer a best practice form. I think that's sound advice. Is that something that the district would be interested in, just sort of reviewing each school's form?
Absolutely. I think that makes a ton of sense. Not sure that's something school committee would want to take on, but I think that is something we should do.
Okay. All right, Jennifer, you wanted to speak?
I'm going to limit my comments because I'm not sure that I have anything more substantial to add than already has been said. I do think that we and the great we as human beings and we as members of the school district have work to do in understanding and defining inclusion and diversity and equity in the bigger, in a large sense, as a community, as a town, as a school district. I mean, I think that that's work that we've been trying to do, and there have been some bumps in the road in doing that. I'm not sure specific numbers are going to be helpful. I'm just keep remembering that we have to sort of keep a space between policy and procedure. Even if we were to put numbers in, what if you don't have in one particular grade at one school enough members for an affinity group, and then what do? You have to move somebody from another school? It gets really complicated. And I think when things are very firm like that in a policy, the policy is supposed to set the tone and intention of the direction of the school. So I guess I'm a and person. I think we do need to think about that, and we need to have a better understanding across our schools, as a school community, as a district, what we mean by these things and what our intentions are. I'm just not sure that the super detailed level of that belongs in the policy.
All right, so we do have some other matters to discuss this evening. So would anyone like to offer some final thoughts on the policy of grouping, inclusion, and placements before we move on to student rights and responsibilities? All right, seeing none, thank you very much for the K-8 principals who joined us. And Hal, if you can stay on, because the next policy we're going to discuss primarily pertains to the high school. K-8 principals are certainly welcome to stay if you would like, but I don't anticipate that we're going to be reviewing any more policies that pertain directly to you. But thank you. Okay, so moving on to student rights and responsibilities. Hal, this is mostly about high school procedures around AWOLs and pupil transfers, and also talks about publication staffs and creating new courses. Could you talk about how the high school's practices possibly reflect this policy, or if they don't, and what the alignment is?
So this is the draft policy that you're talking about? So
I'm referring to the policy that's already in the books right now. Unfortunately, I was not able to create another draft, but I actually think that receiving input from you first prior to putting together a draft, if necessary, would make more sense anyway. So perhaps you could comment on your thoughts on the student rights and responsibilities policy. What I'll say as another introductory remark to that, I was reviewing the student rights and responsibilities policies for other districts. Pretty much every district has one, but it's quite different from ours. It's far more generic. It's usually just 2-3 paragraphs talking about student rights in general terms and about having student government or student council. It does not delve into specifics around absences and transfers and course creation. So one thought for subcommittee members is whether we would be more interested in moving in the direction of using the MASC version as a base for our policy, or whether we would rather work off our existing one, which dates all the way back to 1971, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't contain some good information or good policy rather that we want to retain. So Hal, what are your thoughts?
So, I mean, there's some interesting history here in how the governing of the high school has come about since the 80s, really, and maybe going back to 1971 policy as well. But the whole democratic nature of the high school and the role that the legislature plays in the high school, I think, is the reason that you have such an expansive statement of student rights and responsibilities, because students have the right, along with the legislature, which includes students and staff, to change some of those day-to-day operating procedures in the high school, such as how classes operate and what classes may be put in. So there's a whole, it's a really complicated history there about that comes from this democratic notion of schooling that was advanced and became the way the school operated beginning in the 80s.
Okay, thank you. Do subcommittee members have thoughts on direction for this policy? Do we want to go more with the MASC generic, or do we want to consider modifying the existing policy? Now, so certainly, I would think that the portions of the policy that deal with school publications, that absolutely would need to be changed, in my view, in light of the yearbook policy that we recently got through school committee, because that's now been rendered obsolete. Do subcommittee members have thoughts on direction for this policy?
David, I think in the last meeting when we actually reviewed the policy, we thought it would be good to hear from Hal or other people at the high school, both on this notion of a democratic school. But Al, there were sections that were talking about sort of students having the right to decide on textbook and textbook selection, curriculum decisions. It wasn't clear if those practices are in effect or where they stand and so on. I mean, for some of us, we thought from an equity lens, might be best practices. So we might have been on something in the 70s, but just not clear what the practices are and whether those should be reviewed by somebody at the high school and then seeing either what needs to be updated or removed.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's probably a lot of relics in there that, and maybe some type of reconciliation is necessary to clean that up and make it more, to make it a living document, to make it something that actually reflects what is being done at the high school. So I apologize. I thought that we were going to discuss tonight or the revisions, possible revisions. I didn't realize that you had wanted to go back through the old document, but I can certainly circle back to that and get back to you for next time for that.
No, that's fine. So just to go off of the specific example that Dimitri gave. So we have a section in the current student rights and responsibilities policy, and it's just one sentence, I'll read it. The students in each classroom should be encouraged to assume some responsibility for shaping individual classroom procedures and evaluating instructional materials. So is that something that currently takes place? Is that something that's worth having in a policy? What are your thoughts on that?
Probably not. You could say that it takes place in that at the end of every school year, students do evaluate teachers and are then asked to talk about the materials that were used in that class. And that then goes to the department coordinator who then holds it and then gives it to the teacher themselves to see after grades have come in. So that's, pretty standard procedure in all high school classrooms, that there is that mechanism for feedback from students. And I'm pretty sure that that is ultimately goes back to that policy, which says that students have a voice in that.
Okay. In terms of course creation, what mechanisms currently exist for students at the high school to create their own courses?
Outside of SWS, probably none. I mean, you would talk to students, you might bring them into the conversation about a course that's being proposed, but it's not a realistic way that we would be developing courses for most of the school. But in SWS, the opposite is true. The students do vote on the courses and choose what course they're going to have for the next year. So, when we do the course catalog, for example, we put in some generic ideas of what SWS English class might be, but then the students get together in the spring and vote on what course they're going to do the following year.
Are there still independent studies that are offered to students?
Yeah, but it's a pretty small number. You know, it's not a major portion. It's not a lot of kids that get involved in that.
I'm just thinking back to my own years at the high school where I had a scheduling conflict between two courses and I really wanted to be in both. So the teacher in one of them allowed me to take an independent study as a way to still benefit from the material. And I really appreciated that. So I hope that our students currently have those opportunities as well.
Yes, the Perlman rule, we call that. No, yeah, it's not very frequent, you know, so all of those work as a special action. So I would sign off on any independent study that's given. It's, you know, a dozen a year, maybe we might occasionally, Josh Paris has run something called multivariable calculus and, you know, a higher level calculus class, and he might have 10 kids signed up for that as an independent study. But save that, it's one here, one there, maybe a kid who's TAing in a class or something else, you know, like an advanced Spanish speaker might TA in a Spanish class and get independent study credit. And, you know, occasional situations like the one you described where there was a schedule conflict and a kid had a strong desire for one of the classes, and therefore we might make the accommodation. But, you know, we're not talking about a lot of cases like that.
All right, thank you. Do any subcommittee members have questions for Hal regarding this policy or current high school practices? All right, seeing none, out of respect to Hal's time, I'm going to ask that we skip number 4 for just for a moment to ask Hal a question about the school calendar and parent-teacher conferences. This is specific to grades 9 through 12. And there are some members of the community who pointed out that we currently have early dismissals as a general matter. I'm not talking about just during a pandemic, but that the early dismissals for grades 9 through 12 by our policy are purportedly for the purpose of parent-teacher conferences, but apparently there are not parent-teacher conferences that take place for grades 9 through 12. Is that accurate?
That is correct, right. We don't have the same number of early releases that the elementary schools have. They have many more than we have. There's a host of K-8 dismissals. There's only 2 typically in a given year. There's only 2 outside of this year, of course. There's only 2 typically that we have, and those are generally reserved for 6th, 7th, 8th, 7th and 8th grade teachers to meet with their 9 through 12 colleagues. That's what we use those 2. There's 2 half days in any given year, usually one in December and one in April that we do for just for that purpose. So they're not designed to be for parent conferences, unlike the ones in the elementary, you know, the K to 6, K to 5.
Okay, all right, thank you. That's pretty much all I have for you this evening specifically. So if you wanted to go on with your day, that's perfectly fine, although you're also welcome to stay.
Thank you. I will avail myself of the opportunity to head out of beautiful Brookline High School.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, so now we'll go, I just wanted to get that question out of the way before we go to the calendar section. So now let's go back to where we were.
Before we go on to the calendar, it wasn't clear to me how we were going to proceed with the student rights and responsibilities. Now that there's definitely a gap between what the policy says and what goes on at the high school.
No, I'm going back to that. I just wanted to briefly go to the calendar part just so we could let Hal go because I had that question about grades 9 through 12.
Okay.
All right, so going back now to student rights and responsibilities. How do subcommittee members feel about revising the current policy, sort of removing the provisions that do not reflect current practices? Do we want to go in that direction? Or should we be modeling off of the MASC? Any thoughts on this?
At least from my perspective, because I don't have the MASC in front of me, I probably feel like I want to be able to reread it again in order to weigh in. Unless were you hoping to make the decision tonight at this meeting?
No, we don't have to make a decision tonight.
Okay.
But I would probably be advancing a draft of some kind for our next meeting, because clearly there are at least some changes that I think we could probably agree need to be made, such as around the yearbook. There are a couple lines here about the yearbook and student publications, which have now been rendered obsolete by the standalone yearbook policy that we recently passed. So it's clear that some revisions need to be made. There may have been some discussion at the last meeting around dispensing with this policy entirely. I'm not comfortable with that either, because it is very common for districts to have a student rights and responsibilities policy. It's just, it looks quite different from ours. Casey or Jennifer, go ahead. Jennifer?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you called Casey. I apologize. So I'm hearing what you're saying, David. What do you think is I need to go back and look at the MASC policy, which it sounds like from listening to that it's more streamlined. What are the pieces that we have in ours that aren't in the MASC? Like if you were going to talk in big idea chunks, like what is it that we have in ours that isn't in other school districts or in the MASC?
So I think Dimitri touched on it around the idea behind student democracy and involvement of students on a direct level with their educational experience. In the MASC version, it talks about having student government, but that's about it. It doesn't really get into student engagement in the classroom. It doesn't get into student participation in the curriculum. Even from Hal's remarks with the evaluations at the end of the year, we're doing at least a little bit of that, but I think that would be the main piece that's missing. So one thought could be that we go with the MASC base that seems to be used by all the other districts, but add our own section dealing with student democracy at a level that we would be comfortable with. And it is very common from what I saw. I looked at about a dozen of these where they all have that same basic format, but then some districts will add an extra 2 paragraphs and some will have 3 extra ones. And so they modify off the MASC, but they're not all identical.
That might be the best way to move, where we look at, we take MASC and then we modify for what we think we really need, because the democracy thing is important for us. But also, as I've mentioned before, from an equity lens, increasingly, these are practices that are affirmed to allow for students and community, particularly Black and Brown students, to have a chance to sort of review and comment with schools with the quality of the curriculum, the materials that are being presented. And maybe we don't want to go big on democracy, student democracy, but at least talking about student voice and agency would make sense, and I think would align with our principles and values in the district.
All right, I see Mary Ellen would like to speak. Go ahead, Mary Ellen.
I would propose going to the MASC, and then I just looked up Concord Carlisle Regional High School, and they have a student rights and responsibilities, and then they have a student involvement in decision-making sub-policy, which I really like separating the two. So we should look at districts that have split this. So Concord, Carlisle, and probably Lincoln, Sudbury as high schools probably are very much like Brookline. I didn't look at Lexington, but I think Lexington may have split this, and that may, I think that may fit the need and the desire that we have of our old language, but have an overarching student rights and responsibilities that's very clear, and then a sub policy that gets at the Brookline flavor of student involvement and decision making. Because I think this JIB student is really, it has a student advisory committee in here. School committee will take into consideration student opinions in establishing policy. So I think that piece really resonates with the components that are in the Brookline policy.
Okay. So we do currently have a student involvement and decision-making initiation of courses or clubs policy that, at least in my handbook, immediately follows student rights and responsibilities, but it seems very heavy on procedures about course petition forms, and it's also pretty much just focused around the high school. So I like your suggestion, and I think what we could perhaps do is take some of the material that's from the our current student rights and responsibilities policy shift that over into our current student involvement and decision-making, maybe take out some of the procedural details about petition forms. I don't think we need policies that are that specific.
Right.
And perhaps deal with it that way and then go to the MASC as a
And
base.
yeah, and you mentioned clubs, and clubs are really in the student activity accounts process. So maybe that language can get moved to student activities and be addressed there. So it doesn't, so maybe it's all just got kind of lumped into one location in an update. So I would offer that in terms of the clubs and making sure that there's access to clubs.
All right, Jennifer?
Sorry, I was just going to say that I'm amenable to starting with the MASC policy. I'm that splitting it out is fine too, but what I'm not willing to do is lose the student voice piece there. That's super important to me. So I'm whether we start with our existing one and then we advise, revise that, or if we start with MASC and then add in those pieces or separate that out, however we want to do it. I just think it's really important that stays in, and it may need to be more than a paragraph or two. I don't know. I have to put them side by side and cross out things that don't belong, and I have to mark it up and be confident.
Okay, I would agree with that. Andy, any thoughts? All right, Casey, I saw that you wanted to speak earlier. My apologies. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I will, I'll communicate another time about it. It was back to the, just some wording about the high school placement policy.
Okay.
David, you do have some conversation in the chat.
All right, so member of the public writes, as the parent of a child of color, I can say that even in a small program, it's really difficult for students of color to be comfortable speaking up in front of their peers. Anything we can do to make that expected would go a long way. By expected, I mean give students of small affinity groups tacit permission to make their voices heard. All right, thank you for making that point. It's a little unclear to me, though, whether this is referring to our earlier discussion about inclusion and grouping and placement, or if this is about student voice and our student rights and responsibilities. Either way, though, so it's definitely an important point that perhaps belongs in some measure in both, because this is obviously a very strong Brookline value, and we would want to have it permeate through our policy handbook. All right, thank you. So there's a clarification. It's referring to student voice and student rights. All right, so I'll look to incorporate that in our draft. Any other comments? All right, seeing none, we can now move to a discussion of the special services policy and possible vote. Now, as I explained to some of our administrators in preparation for today, the possible vote that I'm envisioning is to eliminate this policy. So I looked at over a dozen policies from other both peer districts and non-peer districts. I wanted to get a good mix, and not a single one of them has this policy. So as both Casey and Mary Ellen had mentioned at our prior meeting, the special services policy that we have is severely outdated. There are a lot of changes to state and federal law that render it obsolete. A lot of this is covered by the new legislation. So there does not appear to be a need to keep it in our handbook. Would you like to elaborate a little more just to sort of recapitulate that point, or anything else, Casey or Mary Ellen?
No, I think you covered it. Okay. Thank you.
What do subcommittee members think? Would you be comfortable recommending to the full school committee that we remove this policy, given that it's out of date and no one else seems to have it?
David, I am comfortable.
Okay.
Me too.
Would someone like to move that we recommend to the full school committee that we remove the policy on special services?
I'll move it.
All right, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, Dimitri,
Yes.
Andy,
Yes.
Jennifer?
You didn't ask if there were any questions before we took the vote after the motion. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I just want to make sure, I understand that large parts are out of date and there are new laws, and I fully understand that, but are there any pieces that are in this policy that, and I'm asking, I guess, staff or other subcommittee members that aren't covered in another policy? I mean, is there anything missing? Is there anything that protects our students that needs to be in there?
So I looked at that with that lens, Jennifer, and given what, and David referenced this earlier, given what's now been updated in state and federal law, there's actually more protections for families through federal law now than what's in our policy. So the short answer to your question is no, I don't think it's missing anything.
And we can always revise policies. So if we should figure out that something is missing. Okay, so yes, I'm comfortable with that then.
All right, and I also vote yes. So that will be a recommendation for the full school committee. And that brings us to our next agenda item, which is discussion of the school calendar. Now, this was brought to my attention by several community members, and I'm not referring again specifically to any recent negotiations with the BEU around an increase in dismissals for this year for collaboration time. That's not what this is about. It's looking just more broadly, the practice around early dismissals. That's one piece of it. That's why I asked Hal about grades 9 through 12 and parent-teacher conferences. And then another element to this is also cancellations due to inclement weather. Now that we may have remote options, do we want to revise that language to provide for the possibility that snow days could become remote days? So perhaps tackling the snow day issue first, so that might be a bit easier. Mary Ellen or Casey, do you have any indication of the direction the district is going to go in terms of utilizing Zoom in future school years in any capacity?
Mary Ellen may have a more technical answer in terms of our licensing for Zoom. For me, I think it's a practice question. If we are to have a remote day due to inclement weather, I really would want some feedback from teachers about preparation. I think it would be really hard to expect teachers to provide remote teaching, live teaching, depending on when that snow day is called. And so I just want to make sure whatever language we have in there takes into consideration just teacher time and prep to have something that is valuable in front of kids in short notice.
Jennifer?
Casey actually said a number of things that I was thinking. I think that it's really challenging. It will, if we're in full time in the fall, which I hope, I think it's will be an unusual pivot to go to a remote day when kids are already, I think some children have trouble being on Zoom and sort of making that change without having someone there to guide them, an adult. And so I think doing that out of the context of all the skill building that we've built around, that educators have built around Zoom protocol and etiquette and how does it work and like the tech aspects, I just think it'll be in a school year that might otherwise be fully in person to pivot on a snow day to a remote day. I think that would be challenging for both educators and children. That's my opinion. I could be swayed if other arguments were made, but my gut is that I think it would just be very challenging. And I'm not, my vote, or my opinion, we're not voting. My opinion is that I think that we should, in a regular school year, have snow days, traditional snow days. That's my opinion. But I'm very open to hearing other people's opinions.
Andy?
I And quite aside from the practical obstacles, I'm just very, very reluctant to normalize the idea that outside of the special circumstances of this year, like remote instruction could ever replace a day of in-person instruction. We do it this year because we have no choice, but to make it a policy going forward, I think is going a bit far.
I'm probably somewhere in the middle between Jennifer and Andy. Although I like the traditional school day, I do believe there is a place for remote instruction. I do believe the district ought to think of it. I actually wish the district had thought of it 5 years ago, and I think it would have probably been less painful for us as a district to actually respond to COVID. So I do think there is a space for remote instruction, but I think I would hope district leadership can take that on and develop what the vision for that should be and then develop a piece. So that decision to then go remote, if a snow day shows up or not, ought to really be within the district. But I do think as a school committee, I think there is a value for remote instruction. And if I'm thinking about the schooling in the next 20 to 30 years, I think if we want to be a forward-looking district, we ought to be thinking about this deeply.
I agree.
And
with
of
you.
course, like Andy said, I don't think it will ever replace, but I think it can supplement and it can be another opportunity for some students.
I agree with Dimitri. I think that we ought to take from this year we should learn from what has occurred since last March and what's taking place this year and try to really look at where remote education actually benefited students. We've definitely heard a lot about the negatives, and I'm not trying to downplay those negatives at all. But if in any respect it was beneficial in some way, I would not want to dispense with it whole cloth without really looking into that in detail. And I understand that's a much broader question than how to handle snow days. But I think it's a discussion that's worth having, which sort of leads me to my next question for Mary Ellen, which Casey alluded to. Mary Ellen, can you explain to us just sort of on the technicalities of what's the status for remote learning for next year with DESE? Would it even be allowed? Do we have a Zoom license for next year? What would be our capabilities? What would the state allow?
So I don't know is the answer to a number of those questions because I've heard, the only thing I do know is that we're not planning for remote learning next year or remote learning academy. So I would need to check with Feng Yang about the Zoom licenses because those came out of non-upper operating budget funds. So it came out of town cares and it came out of our extra federal funds. That's part of the 360,000 of software. So there's a decision point the district needs to have around Zoom, and are we continuing Zoom and for what purpose? That will need to be a discussion point for all the questions that you just asked. And I believe based on, I can only surmise like anybody else based on what we're hearing is that there's a significant interest of having students return to school. However, I can't imagine there isn't a place for remote learning in schools for some reason. We've had dabbling in this in special ed areas in a number of different cases or home hospital cases where it would actually be really beneficial for students. And I think that's one of the benefits of the OWLs that we have. And so I think there are still lots of questions. We don't really have any planning around it, nor do I think we have anybody, we don't have any planning around it at this point. And I would look to a deputy superintendent for curriculum and instruction for guidance along with KC as student services around guidance and with the student supports that are needed and have it student driven, student support learning driven. So that's my long answer to it depends and I don't know.
All right, thank you. Jennifer, a question I have for you since you're actively a teacher. How do you feel about remote interfacing for purposes of conferencing with parents?
I think that's gone pretty well. It actually helps, I think, some families to make it more accessible because they don't have travel time. They don't necessarily have to take off a whole chunk of time from work. So it increased some flexibility, I think, for some families. It also helps, if you have, I don't know what our plans are for one-to-one devices, but for a lot of students, there's a device at home because the student has it. So that enabled parents to be able to access that technology. So that's something we'd have to think about if we're not doing that and we don't have this sort of one-to-one device rollout. How would we know that families had access to that technology to participate? But maybe it's an option. I mean, I do think, I thought my experience was that it went well and that families seemed okay with that. But that would be an interesting to get feedback on, from family members, if that's something we were interested in for. I mean, I think for me, the next level of questions becomes, what is the district's big idea for keeping up sort of like the Zoom license? What does that cost? Is that the plan? Do we keep all the licenses? Is there just a few licenses per school? And, or are we doing every teacher again? So I think we have to just sort of weigh what are the intentions of the district and the interest in individual teachers, just to make sure we're utilizing technology that we want to keep and that we're paying to keep. I mean, we don't want to pay for something that we think we might use if we don't really plan to use it, or we need to think about the limit and the number of that. But I guess I'm very hesitant to, I think I've heard some ideas about ways that remote learning might be really important. For example, Mary Ellen mentioned, students who may be medically homebound or in the hospital, or special education students who might need that, or a number of any group of students for whom this was really beneficial. But I think we need to do that work and understand it before we make an investment in something. So I'll just say tents. Let's think about them like tents.
So specific to how this pertains to the calendar, we have a question from a member of the public. Can OSS speak to how easily services and accommodations for students on IEPs or 504s could pivot to remote for a snow day?
I think it wouldn't, we couldn't pivot easily. I think there's so many factors that go into it. What's the day of the snow day? What schedule are we following? Do the speech therapists have the materials that they need? The special headsets that we purchased, the Elmos. I mean, I think there would be a lot to think about in order for staff to be fully prepared to pivot and accommodate at the drop of a dime, which I think sort of speaks to, it just falls in line with what we've been saying since we started this discussion, which is that it would be hard to just flip to remote learning on a snow day.
Now, in terms of more administrative functions, so I asked Jennifer about parent-teacher conferences, which sort of ties into the discussion about early dismissals and the purpose for them, at least according to our policy. So our policy dates all the way back to 1970, and it states that the reason for early dismissals is to enable time for parent-teacher conferences. We did hear from Hal earlier that parent-teacher conferences do not take place between grades 9 and 12, yet our policy is saying that's why we have dismissals even for 9 through 12. So I would think at minimum that part's going to have to be changed. But beyond that, just sort of thinking about the nexus between the remote technologies that we now have and perhaps the extra flexibility we can afford to families and staff, even for early dismissals, and maybe it could be, there could be some built-in efficiencies there. So specific to special education, for example, in your opinion, have IEP meetings been fine in a virtual context, maybe for some and not for others? And to what extent do you think that your work with families could be made more efficient or facilitated by the technologies that we're utilizing this year?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. I do think that IEP meetings as a whole are always better when you can be in person. There are so many different sides that are represented at the table. So in terms of IEP meetings, while they've gone fine, some have gone really well and some have not. Virtually, I wouldn't want anything that would allow for more remote IEP meetings, to be honest, in terms of language. And I think the provision of special education services, I think it's the same with IEP meetings. I'm not convinced, to be honest, that the remote style of delivery is conducive for students on IEPs or 504s. I think to the extent that we can push for in-person, the better. To your question, I know there was something in the chat from Linda
Yeah.
Mata. Sorry, Dimitri, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I was going to say that we have some stuff in the comments. and
Yeah,
speaking to this.
yeah, just going back to that, I think parents would love a video option. So if we can put in the policy that teacher conferences could be delivered in different ways, that would be great, because to take a whole half day off of work for a 20-minute meeting just seems silly at this point when we know we can clearly communicate fine via a video option.
But Casey, if I could go back with you just a little bit, like
Yeah.
if we were to think of that, I'm trying to think about some students that I had when I taught at Brookline High who would have been an IEP. If they had a short video of key elements of the classroom lesson that they could actually watch and consume. I'm talking about a 5 to 6. It's a refresher. It's another way to help you summarize key points, or it's the math lesson I'm going over. Again, just a slide. You don't even need to see a teacher. You're seeing a bunch of slides that walk you through how to do this project again. So yes, you were in class, you took it, but you are one of those students who probably need a refresher, or you're the parent working with your students where let's watch that video together. It's 1 or 2 minutes. And now we've got a refresher. Let me help you do the homework. I don't see how that couldn't help enhance or support student learning. And we could develop an ecosystem of something like this.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I view that as supplemental.
Yeah.
And not in replacement of. And when I was speaking
okay.
about that, sorry about that. I was talking about when we are teaching new skills, when we are teaching new materials, it's best to be in person.
Okay.
All right, Jennifer, go ahead.
I'm actually going to jump onto that conversation. And when Dimitri, when you were talking through that, I was thinking like, well, that would be a great resource to put in Google Classroom. So like a place where students can revisit lessons and have a whole bunch of videos now and things, teacher created materials, that doesn't necessarily have to go by the wayside as a resource center, a place where people can revisit lessons or revisit slides or have a digital copy of something they may have misplaced. And so like, there's all sorts of executive functioning things that could be accessed and all sorts of good things that can come. But to me, that's very different than delivering live instruction via Zoom, which it's just a completely different experience. And so I don't know, I just want to jump onto that conversation and say, like, I see it as two kind of very different things.
All right, any other thoughts on this? Okay, so then getting back to the early dismissal question in general, it sounds like there would be agreement on making clear that parent-teacher conferences are not exclusively for the purpose of parent-teacher conferences, the early dismissals rather, are not solely for the purpose of parent-teacher conferences. In terms of the frequency of them, the structure of them, Mary Ellen, am I correct in assuming that we would not have much control over that? That's part of bargaining with the Brookline Educators Union and also DESE requirements.
Mhm.
Could you go over the history perhaps in terms of how it is that we ended up with weekly early dismissals? Just thinking back to my time as a student, which I graduated the high school about 20 years ago. Back then we didn't have early dismissals every week. So can you maybe go over how that evolved over time? Was that something that got negotiated in? Is it just shifting hours around, but it's still the same amount of learning time?
I haven't been here long enough.
Or in general in the state? Depends you see.
Yeah, so the only thing I know from a lot of districts' perspective is a lot of districts went to a weekly release for professional development. And I'm trying to remember if that was really about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And then I'm trying to remember what was happening in education that sort of warranted that kind of professional development release time of a half day once a week. So that it's been around for significant years. Some districts are Wednesdays, some are Thursday. Very few have been Friday. Brookline's a rare one with Friday, as far as I know. But presumably that's for professional development or teacher curriculum development time. In my prior district, we had teacher Thursday and principal Thursdays. That's what we called them at the elementary level. So they were teacher directed or principal directed work, separate from faculty meetings.
Okay. Do you see any value to trying to reduce the number of early dismissals in some way? If in the form of creating more professional days, so making the hours even out, but fewer early dismissals?
I think it's really about how that early dismissal time is used and how you contractually negotiate the use of that time to see value in it. That's how I guess I would answer without having Casey may have an opinion or curriculum instruction person having an opinion.
I missed the last couple of minutes, but I did catch your question, David. I just want to make sure that I understand it. And you're asking whether or not we have an opinion on how half days are used versus days that are specific to professional development.
Right. Or even if it were a day for collaboration time, whatever it might be, just pedagogically, would we be better off having fewer early dismissals, but more extended period blocks of time during certain parts of the calendar? Or do you think it's better to have those consistent early dismissals throughout the year?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things at play here. And so we would have to separate out what's the purpose of and this gets to Mary Ellen's piece, what she was trying to say is an early dismissal day versus a professional development day. So research shows that one-off professional development days don't work in terms of having whatever it is that you want educators to learn to be sticky and have it be impactful. So if we were to set aside time for professional development for staff, it would have to be regular and frequent. In terms of release days for students, I think it would be hard to find anyone to say that it is conducive to student learning to have regular release days. I think Brookline as it is has one of the shortest learning days in the state by hour. And so the more hours that I think we can add to our students' day, thoughtfully created, of course, not to sort of drown our students in less than hours and hours of learning, I would be in favor of. I think we could do so much more if we could not have those release days, but understanding, of course, it's important for teachers to collaborate. I think when I just had to take a short break, you had asked what's the purpose historically, in addition to all staff, faculty being able to get together, teachers in job-alike positions could meet throughout the district. I know that in the past, there were monthly special education meetings. So all middle school, 6th grade math teachers for special education could get together and discuss best practice, current issues, and things like that. So if we could create those opportunities, that would be great. I do wonder where policy intersects with collective bargaining.
So Mary Ellen, to that question from Casey, what can school committee unilaterally control in terms of early dismissal scheduling? Is it when the early dismissals occur, or is it also how many of them? And some of those hours could be redistributed in other ways. Is it hours-based, days-based, number of early dismissal-based?
I think it's a combination, because you have the school calendar intersecting with the teacher's contract around collaborative time and um,
And then just
you
in
know,
terms
in the
of,
school days. So sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that the DESI rule in general is that you need to at least go until 12 o'clock to count as a day. Is that correct? Or is that just for this year?
Generally it's a 4 hour, the assumption is 4 hours. It's a 4 hour school day.
And is that including lunch recess, or it's 4 hours of
4
instruction?
hours instruction. So part of it really is your school day should really be wrapped around what the time on learning requirements are for elementary, middle, and high school. So you're supposed to be at I'm going to get this wrong. So please don't quote me. So I think it's 990 hours for high school, or it's 990, Jennifer, for elementary. 990
I
sticks
think
in
it's
my head.
900. Well, no, now I have to look it up. Now
Yeah,
I'm
so
afraid
it's so there's like a 900 or 990 hours that students are supposed to be having for time on learning. And there's a definition of what that means or what meets those hours. So that's the first sort of part of this whole regulation that you need to, that a district would need to sort of evaluate for its start and end times, break times, recess times, lunch times, all of that within that school day. And then the release time somehow works in there. It works itself in there, which is where that 4 hours comes from. So there's, I don't have all of that at my fingertips, but that's the place you need to start at time and learning. Then you start at your what applies or what is eligible, and then you need to look at what your teacher's contract is for time, compensation and time and break, prep time, and how does that all integrate to know whether you can make any gains in the places that you're looking to make gains or reductions.
Okay,
It's not
thank you.
simple math, clearly. It's like a bad word problem all of a sudden.
Let's see. So we have a comment in the chat. It is not conducive to student learning. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say I looked it up while we were talking. It's 990 for secondary and it's 900 for elementary.
All right, thank you. So we have a comment in the chat from Faith Danowitz, co-chair of CPAC, that it is not conducive to student learning. Changing the course of the day can be difficult for K-8 students on IEPs 504s. So I do share that concern about the sheer number of early dismissals and how that can be disruptive for student scheduling. But of course, it's important for us to have a firm understanding of where we have unilateral control in terms of setting the calendar and where we would need to negotiate with the BEU on these scheduling issues. Casey, it sounds like you mentioned that other districts, the school days now are longer. Do you know if that was something that was negotiated in, or?
I don't. I know that it's been there for some time.
All right, so this is definitely something that we'll need to revisit. We're approaching 6:30, so unless, does someone have any more comments on the calendar for today? We'll definitely bring this up next time. No? Okay, so if we can go to new business briefly. The new business I want to bring up is really just more of a question. Mary Ellen, I know you are overwhelmed with budget preparation, not trying to pile more work on or anything, just seeking a general update for when you think we might have a revised draft of the Section D.
So you picked the whole section, so I'm not quite sure. Working away at it in between times. I think we're going to try to break some of it down for each finance subcommittee, so you may get it in bits and pieces. I need to talk to Mariah. Mariah and I meet every Thursday to review the agenda. So I'll add it to our conversation so that we can chunk it out and make sure that components get on every single meeting that we have from now till whenever we finish. So you may get parts of the section at a time, which will be phenomenal progress.
All right, so that would be appreciated, even if it's
Yeah.
just a little bit at a time, so we can start working on that at our
Yeah, I know that
policy
we have student activities that student activities I think is ready. I don't know if you were able to look at Michael's Glover's edits at all that I had sent you. So that one is actually probably ready, and that one's actually in students. It's not really in the financial policies. It really needs to be in the student section, but that's ready to go. That's so that can take, I guess I would like to put that one forward first, since it's really the most ready.
All right, I'll take a look for that. Maybe I'm just having trouble finding it, but I'll look for that.
Okay, let me know and I'll resend it. Happy to do that.
Okay. And then another question that I have, and I think this would be more for you, Casey. Can you give us maybe an update on the flow chart for the harassment policy?
Sure. So Maria created it, and then now she has Justin Gomes reviewing it.
All right, that's all I had for new business. Anyone else? Andy, Dimitri, Jennifer?
None for me.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating this evening. Some of these policies will return when we convene next month. I found it very informative. Also want to thank again our many principals who appeared this evening. That was great. We had excellent coverage. I thought it was very insightful to hear how each school engages in inclusion and grouping and placement. And we'll convene again next month. Thank you, everyone. Night.